What would you think if everything sank except for a prayer? The fishing trawler, the St. Anne, was torn apart by the waves, its steel hull and diesel engine, and 1,000 pounds of fish plunging into the blackness of the North Atlantic. Splintered wood and the rainbow sheen of fuel were all that remained on the surface. That and the small hand-carved statue of the Virgin Mary, bobbing in the swell as calmly as if it were resting on a mantelpiece. Her painted blue eyes, fixed on some point beyond the horizon, did not see the wreckage. Her wooden hands clasped in prayer did not feel the freezing cold. She simply floated, a piece of unwavering stillness in an ocean of chaos. Liam's life had shrunk to the size of a single room in a boarding house on Lincoln Street in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. The air smelled of dust and old coffee. Through the salt-stained window, he could see the town's famous waterfront, the tall ships and brightly colored buildings, a constant, mocking reminder of the life he no longer had. He was a fisherman with no boat, a man whose hands, thick with calluses from hauling nets, now did nothing but tremble around a ceramic mug. He was the only one who had come back. They had pulled him from the water, hypothermic and half-drowned, his lungs burning with salt water. His boat was gone. His livelihood was gone. His younger brother, Sean, was gone. All of it was at the bottom of the ocean, miles off the coast that his family had fished for 3 generations. Before every trip, his mother had made him place the small wooden statue of the Virgin on a shelf in the wheelhouse. A family heirloom, carved by his great-grandfather from a piece of driftwood. For protection, she'd said. Now the statue was the only thing left besides him, and he did not feel protected. The sound of the bells from St. Norbert's Roman Catholic Church just a few blocks away on King Street no longer called him to anything. It was just a noise, a dull metallic clang that marked the passing of another hour he had to get through. He'd stopped going inside. The heavy oak doors might as well have been welded shut. The silence in his room was a better fit for the silence where his faith used to be. The memory came at night, in the moments between waking and sleeping. It wasn't a dream. It was a drowning. The scream of the wind and the groan of twisting metal. The deck of the St. Anne tilting at an impossible angle, slick with rain and freezing spray. He remembered the weight of his boots, the futile grip of his fingers on the rail. He saw Sean, his younger brother by 5 years, his face white in the stark glare of the emergency lights. One moment Sean was there, fighting to secure a loose crate, his yellow oilskins a beacon in the storm. The next, a wave, a wall of black water, crashed over the side. It was impossibly fast. It simply took him. Liam remembered screaming his brother's name into the gale, the sound swallowed by the storm. He remembered the lurch of the boat as it gave up its fight, the sudden, sickening drop. In the wheelhouse, just before the windows shattered, he saw the statue. It sat on its little shelf, perfectly still, its serene, painted face illuminated by the flickering red light of the dying electronics. He was found clinging to a piece of the shattered hull hours later, his body a block of ice. At the Fishermen's Memorial Hospital in Lunenburg, they told him he was lucky. He never felt lucky. He felt like a loose thread, pulled from a tapestry that had been utterly destroyed. The doctor spoke of trauma, of survivor's guilt. Liam just heard the echo of the waves and the silence, where his brother's voice should have been. 3 weeks later, on a raw November morning, the crew of another longliner, the Bluefin, was hauling their nets a few miles from where the St. Anne went down. They found it caught in the lines, tangled in seaweed but otherwise untouched. The wooden statue of the Virgin Mary, not waterlogged, not scarred by the rocks. It was as if it had been placed there moments before. They brought it back to Lunenburg. The news traveled faster than the boat, a ripple of whispers that turned into a crowd gathering on the wharf beside the Fisheries Museum of the Atlantic. The Bluefin docked, and one of the crew, an old fisherman named Alistair, carried the statue onto the pier. He held it with a reverence usually reserved for a newborn child. A hush fell over the dozens of people gathered there. Tourists with cameras lowered them. Fishermen in worn coveralls took off their hats. Someone in the back dropped a set of car keys, the jangle unnaturally loud in the sudden, profound silence. The statue was smaller than it seemed in memory, its blue mantle faded by a century of salt air, its face calm and unchanging. Liam stood at the edge of the crowd, drawn by the commotion. He saw the statue in Alistair's hands, the same one from the wheelhouse. He felt a coil of something hot and tight in his gut. A miracle, he heard someone whisper. He saw his mother in the crowd, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. He scoffed, the sound a harsh rasp in the quiet, and turned his back, walking away before anyone could see the expression on his face. The town started to talk. Over fish and chips at the old fish factory restaurant, the story was told and retold. At the Knot Pub on Dufferin Street, fishermen argued about it over pints. Some called it a sign, a blessing for a town that had seen too much loss. Others, more practical, tried to explain it away with talk of wood density and ocean currents. The statue was given to the priest at St. Norbert's Roman Catholic Church. Father Michael placed it on a small linen-covered table near the baptismal font, a place of honor. People started to visit. They would come in not for Mass, but just to stand for a moment and look at the small wooden figure that had survived the Atlantic. They left small offerings, a wildflower, a folded dollar bill, a child's smooth gray stone from the beach. For Liam, the town's reverence was like a wall of glass between him and everyone else. He was the man who survived while his brother drowned. Now he was the man who sneered at a miracle. When he walked down Montague Street, conversations would quiet. Old friends would give him a tight nod instead of a wave. He felt their unspoken questions, their pity. He was a ghost in his own hometown, haunted not just by what he'd lost, but by what had, impossibly, been found. The statue's survival felt like a judgment, a divine punchline to a joke he didn't understand. The cold of the sea had settled deep into Liam's bones. It lived in his joints, a persistent, grinding ache. At night, sleep offered no escape, only the recurring image of a black wave and a vanishing yellow slicker. He took to walking the waterfront after midnight, when the colorful facades of the historic buildings were just gray shapes against a black sky. The masts of the docked ships looked like a forest of bare, skeletal trees. A tremor had taken root in his right hand. It started small but grew more persistent, a fine, rhythmic shaking that made it hard to hold a pen, let alone a mug of tea. The hand that had once expertly mended nets and steered a trawler through a gale was now a stranger to him. He kept it shoved in his pocket, hiding its betrayal. One evening, his father found him on a bench near the Blue Nose 2 schooner. He sat beside Liam, the silence stretching between them. "Your mother worries," his father said, his voice rough. "Father Michael asked about you." Liam just stared out at the harbor, the water a sheet of dark, moving glass. He felt a pressure in his chest, a weight that had nothing to do with air or water. It was the weight of an empty space. He couldn't speak, so he just shook his head and walked away, leaving his father sitting alone in the gathering dusk. A nor'easter blew in, lashing Lunenburg with a cold, driving rain. The wind howled through the ship riggings in the harbor, a high, mournful sound. Liam couldn't stay in his room. The four walls felt like they were closing in. He pulled on his jacket and walked out into the storm, the rain plastering his hair to his scalp in seconds. He didn't know where he was going, but his feet carried him up the hill, toward the dark stone of St. Norbert's. He stood across the street from the church, a silhouette against the wind-whipped rain. He had no intention of going in. He just stood there, soaked and shivering, watching the old building as if it held an answer he didn't want. And then he saw it, a light in one of the side windows where he knew the statue had been placed. It wasn't an electric light. It was soft and warm, a steady, gentle glow that seemed to push back against the storm's fury. As he stared, a scent cut through the cold, wet air. It was impossible, but it was there. Not the smell of salt and decay from the low tide, but the sweet, distinct fragrance of beach roses, the kind that grew wild on the dunes in the heat of July. In the middle of a November storm, the air filled with the smell of summer. A profound silence seemed to descend, the howling wind fading to a distant hum. Then, the large bell in the church tower, the one that only rang for Sunday Mass and funerals, tolled a single, deep, resonant note that vibrated through the soles of his wet boots. Across King Street, in a second-floor apartment, Eleanor Gable was about to draw her curtains for the night. She saw the man standing in the rain. Then her eyes were drawn to the church. She saw the soft light from the window, a warm pulse in the darkness, and heard the single, inexplicable toll of the bell. She stood frozen at her window, her hand on the cord, long after the light had faded. The next morning, the sky was scrubbed clean. The sun glinted off the wet streets and rooftops, and the air was crisp and calm. Liam walked back to St. Norbert's. The heavy doors were unlocked. He hesitated for only a second before pushing one open and stepping inside. The church was empty, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, painting patterns of color on the stone floor. His footsteps echoed in the vast silence. He walked toward the small table where the statue stood. There, at its base, lay a single, perfect blush-pink beech rose. Its petals were fresh, holding a few drops of water that sparkled like tiny jewels in the morning light. It was late autumn, nothing like it should have been in bloom. He reached out a hand, the tremor still there but somehow lessened. He didn't touch the rose. Instead, his fingers went to the base of the statue, to the smooth, pale wood. He saw a small, white smudge of encrusted salt near the bottom of her robe, a tiny remnant of the ocean that the parishioners had missed. Slowly, deliberately, Liam knelt. The cold of the stone floor seeped through the denim of his jeans. He didn't know any prayers, not anymore. The words were gone, but the movement remained. He stayed there for a long time, his head bowed. With his thumb, he carefully wiped the grain of salt from the statue's base. It was the first useful thing his hands had done in months. A change began in Lunenburg, small and quiet, like the turning of the tide. Alistair, the old fisherman from the Blue Fin, had been in a bitter dispute with a rival captain for years. One morning, the rival captain found a new, unopened thermos of hot coffee waiting for him on the console of his boat. There was no note. A group of teenagers who usually spent their evenings making noise near the bandstand at the top of King Street started showing up at the waterfront with garbage bags, quietly picking up the trash left by tourists along the docks. They didn't say why. They just did it. Liam's mother went to the Hillcrest Cemetery to place flowers on the simple granite marker that stood for Sean. She found Liam there, on his knees, pulling the weeds that had grown around its base. He looked up when he heard her approach, and for the first time since the sinking, he met her eyes. He didn't smile, but the hard, distant look was gone. A young paramedic, the one who had treated Liam for hypothermia on the rescue boat, saw him down at the wharf. A fishing boat from another town had just come in, its nets badly damaged by a storm. Liam was there, his hands finally steady, showing the boat's young captain a complex knot for mending the torn mesh, his voice low and patient. He wasn't just showing him how to fix a net. He was speaking a language he thought he had forgotten. Liam never went back to sea. The call of the deep water had been replaced by a pull toward something else. He started volunteering at the Fisheries Museum of the Atlantic, the same place where the statue had first come ashore. He didn't preach or talk of miracles. He swept the floors, polished the brass on the old ship displays, and learned the stories behind the artifacts. He became a guide. With quiet authority, he would lead school groups and tourists through the exhibits, explaining the history of the dory fisherman and the Blue-Nose legacy. He had a gift for it, for making the past feel present. He always ended his tours in the room dedicated to those lost at sea, a quiet space with walls covered in brass plaques bearing names. He would tell them the story of the St. Anne. He spoke of the storm, of the loss of his boat and his brother. And he would tell them about the small wooden statue that came back. He didn't call it a miracle. He called it a reminder. Sometimes, he'd say, his voice steady, the most important things aren't the things that save us from the storm, but the things that survive it with us. The statue remained at St. Norbert's, and visitors often remarked on the faint, sweet scent of roses that seemed to linger in that corner of the old stone church. Sometimes faith isn't found in a dramatic rescue from the waves, but in the quiet endurance of a small piece of wood that refuses to sink. It's a lesson that what we choose to hold on to, memory, community, a flicker of hope, can become the vessel that carries us back to shore when everything else has been lost to the deep. It is the grace that floats. If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to and share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us your moment of unexpected grace in the comments.